The Terran freighter Cormorant was 11 hours from breaking up. Hull compromised, reactor failing, 406 souls aboard, and no Earth vessel within 9 days burn. Captain Amelia Reyes did not transmit to Earth. She transmitted on the open galactic distress band, the one every species monitors and nobody answers, and she said 11 words. 9 empires that had been at war with each other for 2 centuries turned their fleets around. This is not a story about a shipwreck. It is a story about a debt. For 40 years, Earth's search and rescue fleet had answered every alien distress call it received. 2,300 missions, no payment, no conditions, no questions asked. The galaxy called the open band a void. Policy across 9 empires dictated that no vessel would risk resources for a foreign ship, but Captain Reyes wasn't asking for charity. She was calling in a debt nobody knew existed, and the response would do more than save 406 lives. It would accidentally end 2 wars. The galaxy had been burning for 200 years. 9 major empires, hundreds of client species, and a web of alliances and hatreds so tangled that no single generation had known peace. 4 of those empires were currently in active, shooting wars with each other. The Kesh Dominion and the Jaith Combine had been exchanging fire over disputed mineral belts for 96 years. The Vrax Hegemony and the Tenderi Conquered spanned a front of 17 star systems, trading lives for debris on a weekly cadence. The open galactic distress band was a relic from a more hopeful era, a universal channel that every ship was required to monitor by treaty, but that no empire had officially answered in living memory. Responding meant diverting warships, exposing flanks and risking resources for strangers, potentially enemies. It was considered political suicide. The band had become a void, a place where the dying screamed into silence, and every species had learned not to listen. No one had ever expected a human to use it. Humanity had entered the galactic community late and quietly. They possessed no overwhelming military, no ancient technological secrets, no territorial ambitions. What they did possess was a search and rescue fleet that operated on a principle alien to every other power: unconditional obligation. Over 40 years, Earth's SAR vessels had answered 2,300 distress calls from non-human ships. They did not ask who was aboard, which empire they served, or whether payment would be forthcoming. If a reactor failed on a Krellian barge, a human cutter appeared. If a Jaith colony ship vented atmosphere, human medics were the first aboard. If a Vrax patrol boat hit a mine, human engineers bled to patch their hull. The galaxy had kept careful records. Every empire maintained detailed databases of the favors they owed, even if they never intended to repay them. It was an accounting of shame, filed away and ignored, because no one believed the debt would ever be called in. And then the Cormorant broke. The Terran freighter Cormorant was not a warship. It was a colony supply vessel, 54 years old, hauling terraforming equipment and 406 souls to a fledgling settlement on Arcadia Prime. 61 of those souls were children, families traveling together to build a new life. The ship was 40 light hours from the nearest Earth vessel, 9 days at maximum burn, when a microfracture in the reactor casing gave way. In 20 minutes, the containment field degraded to 11%. The hull breached in 3 sections. Chief Engineer David Okonkwo calculated that the ship would tear itself apart within 11 hours. Captain Amelia Reyes had served 12 years in the SAR fleet before transferring to civilian freight. She had pulled 317 people from dying ships, 17 species, without losing a single life. She knew with absolute clarity that no human help was coming. Earth was too far. The math was final. So she opened a channel that no captain opened and no empire answered, and she transmitted the manifest: 406 names, ages, species, and 1 line. 11 words she had written on a datapad when she realized the children would not see Arcadia. We are 406 souls. Any flag is welcome here. The signal reached the listening posts of 9 empires simultaneously. Initial response was universal: silence. Standard protocol required no action. Doctrine dictated that diverting ships from wartime positions was dereliction. In the Jaith Combine Command Hub, a junior communications officer flagged the transmission and was told to log it and forget it. In the Kesh War Room, an intelligence analyst noted that 406 humans were about to die and returned to plotting fleet movements against Jaith positions. In the Vrak's High Command, no one even mentioned it, but the databases knew. Every Empire system automatically cross-referenced the transmitting ship's registration with the ledger of past rescues. And the ledger for humanity was appalling. In 40 years, Earth had never once been on the requesting side of the equation. They had only ever given. Now the server arrays began feeding that information to the screens of admirals, strategists, and captains, who suddenly found it impossible to look away. One Kesh fleet commander, Admiral Krellies, stared at a record showing that 612 Kesh soldiers owed their lives to human SAR teams, including his own sister, pulled from a depressurized medical frigate 12 years earlier. He turned to his navigation officer and gave an order that would break the strategic posture of a century-long war. Set course for the Cormorant, flank speed. Word spread faster than any formal directive. Within 37 minutes, 3 Jaith cruisers had declared a temporary operational pause and altered trajectory toward the dying freighter. Vrak's command, which had never once acknowledged a debt to humanity, discovered that 6 of its captains had been personally rescued by humans and were now refusing direct orders to stand down. The Tendery Concord, locked in a bitter stalemate with the Vraks, broadcast an open declaration. Any ship moving to assist the Cormorant would receive safe passage through conquered space for the duration of the rescue. Ships that had been firing on each other hours earlier were now transmitting ceasefire acknowledgments on the open band, a channel that had never carried the word of peace between them. The impossible was unfolding, not because governments decided, but because individual commanders refused to let the debt go unanswered. And yet, as rescue fleets from 9 empires converged on a single point in space, none of them knew that the Cormorant's reactor was deteriorating faster than the engineering models predicted. They were racing toward a ship that had less than 6 hours left, and the mathematics of mercy were about to collide with the physics of catastrophe. The first ship to break formation was the Kesh heavy cruiser Vindicator, under Admiral Krellies. He did not consult the Supreme War Council. He did not request permission. He transmitted a fleet-wide order that took his entire battle group off the front lines and onto a heading that violated 17 standing directives. In the Vindicator's wardroom, Krellies had pulled up the archive footage of the rescue that saved his sister. The human cutter had appeared out of nowhere, grappled a depressurized medical frigate, and held it stable for 11 hours while engineers in zero-gravity suits patched 14 separate hull breaches. 2 of those engineers had died when a bulkhead collapsed. Their names were listed in the file: Petty Officer Lin Nguyen, age 27, and Chief Engineer Marcus Okonkwo, brother of the man who was now fighting to keep the Cormorant's reactor alive. When Krellies told his command staff that they were going to repay that debt, nobody argued. 3 minutes later, the Vindicator's escorts adjusted their own courses. The group moved as one. The Jaith Combine's response was even more chaotic. The Combine is a militarized hive culture, structured around consensus hierarchies that require days of deliberation before any major strategic shift. But consensus broke. 3 cruiser captains, Sickle of the Second Swarm, Torvin of the Deepward Fleet, and Jashel of the Forward Arm, issued a joint declaration of operational pause without waiting for central authorization. This had never happened in the Combine's history. Sickles' communication to High Command was famously brief. "We are responding to a debt of honor. Relieve us upon our return." The Combine's Central Intelligence later estimated that the pause opened a tactical window that the Kesh could have exploited to devastating effect. But the Kesh had paused too. The war had not stopped because of a treaty. It had stopped because a human freighter was dying, and the warriors of two ancient enemies discovered they shared the same ledger. The Vrax hegemony presented a different problem. The hegemony's military doctrine explicitly forbade responding to non-Vrax distress calls. The reasoning was simple. The hegemony was the galaxy's dominant predator species, and predators did not answer pleas from prey. But the doctrine had never accounted for the fact that over 200 Vrax soldiers owed their lives to human rescue operations. Captain Drex of the Vrax destroyer Worldclaw had been one of them. 23 years earlier, his patrol boat had struck a dormant mine left over from a forgotten border skirmish. The explosion killed 40 crew members instantly and left Drex pinned under debris with a shattered carapace and failing lungs. A human medical team from the SAR vessel Promise pulled him out, rebuilt his thoracic cavity with field grafts, and spent 6 days nursing him back to consciousness. When Drex saw the cormorant's distress signal, he did not see a foreign ship. He saw the Promise. He saw the faces of the medics who had refused to let him die. He transmitted his intent to Hegemony Command, knowing full well that it constituted insubordination punishable by execution. Then 5 other Vrax captains, all with rescue records in their personnel files, declared that they would accompany him. The enforcers of the hegemony's doctrine were now openly defying it. And no one in high command could decide what to do about it, because the hegemony's own records showed that every mutinous captain was acting on the same code of honor that the hegemony claimed to embody. While the fleets converged, the cormorant was dying faster than anyone aboard could bear to admit. Chief Engineer Okonkwo had stabilized the reactor temporarily by venting plasma directly into the drive chamber, a maneuver that bought them perhaps 2 extra hours, but guaranteed catastrophic failure the moment the containment field dropped below 3%. The field was at 8.4 and falling. Reyes had ordered the children gathered in the central habitat ring, the most shielded section of the ship. The adults had been assigned to damage control teams, knowing that most of them would not survive if the hull gave way. Reyes herself remained on the bridge, monitoring the galactic band, waiting for silence. The first response came 41 minutes after her transmission. It was not a government. It was a single Kesh freighter captain named Reth, commanding a civilian cargo vessel who had been passing within 2 light towers. His message was simple: "I am 3 hours away. I have room for 90. Hold on." Reyes read it aloud to the bridge crew. Someone wept. Reth's message triggered a cascade. Within the hour, the Cormorant's communications console lit up with incoming signals. The Tendery Concord had declared safe passage corridors. 4 independent merchant captains from non-aligned species announced they were diverting. A Jaith medical frigate reported it would arrive in 4 hours. Then the big signatures appeared, the drive wakes of military vessels burning at maximum acceleration. Reyes counted them. 9 distinct signatures, 9 different profiles, 9 empires converging on the same point in space. She did not understand why. She did not know about the ledgers, about the 2,300 rescues, about the admiral and his sister, and the debt that the galaxy had quietly accumulated. She only knew that she was the captain of a dying ship, and that the galaxy, for the first time in recorded history, had answered the open band. But the mathematics of mercy were not the only mathematics in play. Every empire that sent a ship had to account for the strategic cost. The Kesh-Jaith front stretched across dozens of star systems, and any gap in the line was an invitation. The Vrax-Tendery conflict had been grinding for so long that both sides had automated their firing solutions. The idea of a voluntary pause was considered absurd. Yet the gaps did not close. The Jaith deployed secondary fleets to cover the Kesh positions that had been abandoned. The Kesh reciprocated by pulling back patrol wings from contested zones. No commander on either side had authorized this. It was happening because the logic of war had been temporarily displaced by something older, the logic of honor. And in the halls of power, the political machinery was grinding into panic. The Vrak's High Council convened an emergency session to debate the removal of the mutinous captains. The Jaith Consensus Chamber began a formal deliberation on whether the Combine could legally punish officers who had acted to repay a debt. The Kesh Supreme War Council split into factions, with the hardliners demanding that Krellies be court-martialed, and the moderates pointing out that a Kesh admiral who had fought for 40 years was owed the benefit of the doubt. None of them understood yet that the Cormorant was not just a rescue. It was a referendum on the entire architecture of galactic conflict. On the Cormorant, the reactor containment field dropped to 6%. Okonkwo transmitted a damage assessment to the bridge, estimated structural integrity failure at hull sections 7 through 12 within 90 minutes. Reyes made the decision that no captain ever wants to make. She ordered evacuation drills to begin, with the children loaded into the remaining functional escape pods. The pods had a survival endurance of 8 hours. The nearest rescue ship was 2 hours out, but it was a civilian cargo hauler with limited life support capacity. The military vessels were 4 hours away. If the reactor failed before they arrived, the pods would be a death sentence. Reyes stood on the bridge, watching the countdown clock, and told her first officer to prepare the crew for the possibility that not everyone would be saved. Then she asked for volunteers to stay behind and manage the evacuation. Every hand on the bridge went up. What Reyes did not know, what no one knew, was that the Cormorant's distress signal had not just reached the empires. It had reached the archives. Every ship that had ever been rescued by Earth was logged in a public database maintained by the Terran SAR fleet as a matter of transparency. The database had never been used for anything except record-keeping, but now the galaxy was searching it. Species who had never met a human were pulling up rescue records and discovering that their own people had been saved by these strangers. The sheer scale of the debt was becoming visible for the first time. Not just soldiers and officers, but civilians, scientists, diplomats, and refugees. Humanity had been quietly weaving a safety net across the galaxy for 40 years, and no one had noticed until the net was pulled tight around a single dying freighter. The revelation hit the galactic news networks. A Jaith journalist obtained a copy of the manifest Reyes had transmitted, 406 names, ages, species, and published it. The list included children as young as 2 months, 61 children. The galaxy, which had spent 2 centuries learning to look away from suffering, suddenly found itself unable to look away from 406 faces. The first military ship to reach the Cormorant was not Kesh or Jaith or Vrax. It was a tender-reconquered patrol frigate, the Silent Cord. Its captain, Alara Ven, had been monitoring the crisis from the moment the distress signal was logged. The Conquered was not at war with any of the responding empires, but it was the arbiter of the safe passage corridors, and Ven had positioned her ship on the edge of the convergence zone. She arrived 22 minutes before the Kesh Vindicator. What she found was worse than any damage report had suggested. The Cormorant's hull had buckled in 3 places. Emergency force fields were failing. Debris trailed behind the freighter like a comet's tail. Ven's sensors picked up 43 life pods already ejected, drifting in a scattered arc. She transmitted to all incoming ships, "The Cormorant is breaking apart. I am beginning recovery operations. I need all available medical support." The race had become a triage. That transmission changed everything. The military vessels, which had been bound by protocol to maintain approach vectors and deconfliction procedures, abandoned them. The Vindicator pushed its engines to 110% of rated maximum. The Jaith medical frigate, which was not designed for combat acceleration, overloaded its inertial dampeners to arrive 18 minutes early. The Vrak's destroyers, built for killing, reconfigured their launch bays to receive evacuees. Ad hoc coordination protocols emerged between ships that had been firing on each other 2 days earlier. Kesh and Jaith officers were speaking directly, without intermediaries, to coordinate pod recovery patterns. Tendery medics were preparing to receive Vrak's casualties. The operational definition of enemy had been temporarily suspended, replaced by a single imperative: save the cormorant. And then the reactor containment field hit 3%, and David Okonkwo's last-ditch venting procedure failed. The Corps began a cascade shutdown that would release enough radiation to kill anyone left aboard within 15 minutes. Reyes ordered the final evacuation. She and Okonkwo stayed, along with a volunteer damage control team of 12, to ensure the last pods launched safely. The last pod held 11 children and 2 adult guardians. It jammed on the launch rail. Reyes crossed the ship in 4 minutes, climbed into the launch bay, and manually released the clamps. The pod launched. The radiation spiked. The bridge log registered Captain Amelia Reyes's final transmission: pod launched. All souls away. Cormorant signing off. She was still aboard along with 12 others when the reactor went critical and the ship broke apart. The mathematics of mercy had demanded a final payment, and the captain had made it. But what the rescuers did not yet know was that the debt kept growing, and the consequences of her sacrifice were about to reshape the galaxy's political order in ways that no empire had ever imagined possible. The rescue operation was completed in 17 hours. 43 escape pods were recovered. All 406 souls aboard the Cormorant were accounted for, 405 survivors and 1 body. Captain Amelia Reyes was found in the wreckage of the launch bay, her suit's emergency beacon still pinging, her hand still on the manual release clamp she had pulled to free the last pod. Chief Engineer David Okonkwo had died beside her, along with 11 of the 12 volunteers who had stayed to ensure the evacuation. Only one, Ensign Priya Varma, had been blown clear when the reactor breached, and she was pulled from the debris field with degree radiation burns and a broken spine. She would survive. The others did not. The tally ran across every news feed in the galaxy. 406 lives, but 13 dead, and the 13 were the ones who had chosen to stay. The math of sacrifice was brutal and precise, but the number that broke the galactic public was not the death count. It was the 11 words. As salvage teams recovered the Cormorant's black box, they found the full text of Reyes's final transmission, sent in the last seconds before the reactor went critical. She had not just sent the manifest. She had added a line to the end of the log, a personal note she must have typed while running to the launch bay. It read, "We are 406 souls. Any flag is welcome here." Those were the words she had broadcast to the open band. And now they were being read by every intelligence agency, every newsroom, and every civilian who cared to look. The words spread like fire through dry grass. Within 48 hours, they had been translated into over 200 languages, including the 9 dominant tongues of the responding empires. They appeared on public monuments before any government authorized them. They were painted on the hulls of civilian ships, tattooed on the arms of rescue workers, and spoken aloud in council chambers where war had been the only language for generations. The political machinery, which had been scrambling to contain the fallout, now faced an impossibility. Admiral Krellies of the Kesh was hailed as a hero by his own people before the Supreme War Council could even draft charges against him. The Jaith captains who had broken consensus were greeted by swarms of civilians bearing gifts. a display of public affection so overwhelming that the consensus chamber could not move against them without risking a full social rupture. The Vrak's High Command, which had been debating execution for the mutinous captains, watched its own military ranks fracture as news feeds showed Vrak's destroyers unloading human children into Tenderry medical bays. The image of a Vrak soldier, a species known for aggression and cold efficiency, carrying a sobbing human toddler wrapped in a thermal blanket became the most shared media file in galactic history. It was titled simply, 11 Words, and then the ceasefires began to hold. Not because of treaties or negotiations, because the captains and crews who had worked side by side to save the Cormorant refused to return to the front lines. They had spent 17 hours in a shared operation, coordinating search grids, transferring patients, and stabilizing life pods. They had learned each other's names. They had eaten together in makeshift mess halls set up aboard rescue ships. They had held each other's wounded. When the orders came to resume combat postures, the refusal was not dramatic. It was quiet and it was total. On the Kesh Jaith front, Admiral Crelly sent a personal message to Captain Sickle of the Jaith Combine. The message read, "I have fought you for 40 years. I will not fight you tomorrow. Find someone else." Sickle's reply was even shorter, "Agreed." The two fleets, which had been exchanging fire for 96 years, simply stood down. The Supreme War Council threatened mass court-martials, but the number of officers who mutinied was too large to prosecute. The war, for all practical purposes, ended that week. The same thing happened on the Tenderry Vrak's front. The Vrak's destroyer Worldclaw, under Captain Drex, had been docked alongside the Tenderry frigate Silent Cord for refueling and medical transfers. Drex and Captain Alara Venn, who should have been mortal enemies, had spent the night comparing damage reports and sharing supply inventories. When the hegemony ordered Drex to return to combat operations against the conquered, he transmitted a formal refusal, citing the debt of honor that had brought him to the Cormorant, and the secondary debt he now felt toward the conquered crews who had saved his wounded personnel. Venn, independently, refused to fire on the Worldclaw. Within days, 4 more Vrak's captains and 3 Tenderry commanders had declared similar stands. The Hegemony High Council, facing the complete collapse of its forward fleet's morale, declared a unilateral ceasefire for humanitarian review. The review never ended. The war never resumed. But the full magnitude of what had happened did not become clear until the memorials were built. 9 empires, each with its own architectural traditions, its own languages, its own rituals for the dead, erected monuments to the Cormorant, and every one of them used the same 11 words. On Kesh, a spire of obsidian rose in the capital, carved with the names of the 13 fallen and the phrase, "Any flag is welcome here," in Kesh script. On Jaith Prime, a living garden was planted around a central stone engraved with the words, arranged so that the names of the rescued children formed a spiral around Reyes' name. On Vraks, where public memorials for non-Vraks were unprecedented, the High Council commissioned a statue of a human hand holding a release clamp, the words etched into the base. And on Tenderry, the conquered erected a wall of remembrance on which the names of all 406 souls were inscribed, followed by Reyes' final transmission in her own language, English, with translations beneath in every Tenderry dialect. 9 worlds, 9 languages, 1 phrase. The captain who had typed those words in the final minutes of her life had no idea she was writing a galactic creed. She died thinking she had failed, that her ship was destroyed, that her crew might perish, that her message might vanish into the void. She never learned that the void had listened. She never learned that the children she saved included the daughter of a Vrak's general who would later cast the deciding vote to make the ceasefire permanent. She never learned that David Okonkwo's brother, who died beside her, had a son who would grow up to become the first human diplomat to the Jaith Combine. She never learned that her 11 words ended 2 wars. The deeper twist, the one that still haunts historians, is that 3 of the 9 ceasefires held permanently. The Kesh-Jaith conflict, which had spanned nearly a century, never reignited. The Tenderivrak's front, which had claimed millions of lives, dissolved into a demilitarized zone that eventually became a joint trade corridor. A third war between the minor powers of the Feln Alliance and the Drith Compact had also paused during the rescue and never resumed, though that was less a miracle than a footnote. 3 wars, extinguished not by diplomacy or conquest, but by the gravitational pull of a single act of decency. The galaxy's political scientists still struggle to model it. The military historians still argue about whether it was the debt, the images, or the simple human fact of a captain who stayed behind to pull a jammed clamp. But the memorials do not argue. They stand. And on each one, in 9 different languages, the same 11 words are carved alongside a single name: Amelia Reyes. A woman who never meant to change the galaxy, but who showed it in the moment when it mattered most, what a debt of honor truly looked like. The memorials did not simply commemorate the dead. They rewired the living. In the first year after the Cormorant, 9 empires found themselves in possession of something they had never truly owned: a shared story. The story was not about territory or resources or ideology. It was about a human captain who typed 11 words while running toward a jammed launch clamp. And that story proved to be more powerful than any weapon ever fielded by any of them. The Kesh-Jaith border, once a scar of trench warfare orbiting dead moons, became a demilitarized economic zone within 18 months. Trade convoys replaced patrol wings. Joint mining operations began on asteroids that had previously been used for cover during firefights. The Supreme War Council of Kesh, which had threatened Admiral Krellies with court-martial, instead awarded him the Star of Honor, the highest military decoration in Kesh history. His citation made no mention of combat victories. It read, "For choosing peace when peace was the harder path." Krellies served another 10 years before retiring to a coastal estate, where he planted a garden in the shape of the cormorant's habitat ring. Every year, on the anniversary of the rescue, he would stand in the center of that garden and recite the 11 words aloud. His grandchildren learned them before they learned the names of their own war heroes. Admiral Krellies was not alone in this ritual. Across the galaxy, the anniversary of the Cormorant's final transmission became an informal holiday, observed first by civilians and eventually by governments. The date, March 17th, by Earth's calendar, was marked on 9 imperial calendars as the day of open signal. On that day, every ship in every fleet was required to pause for 1 minute and monitor the open distress band in silence. The band that had been a void for centuries became, for 60 seconds each year, the most listened-to frequency in the galaxy. In the first decade, no distress calls were detected during the pause. In the 11th year, a lone cargo hauler from a species no one had ever heard of transmitted a request for navigation assistance. 7 ships from 4 different empires responded. The void had been permanently broken. The children of the Cormorant grew up carrying a weight they did not fully understand. The 61 miners aboard the freighter had been too young to grasp the politics of what happened, but they were old enough to remember the cold, the shaking, and the face of the woman who pulled them from the darkness. Several of them testified, years later, that they did not know Captain Reyes's name until they saw it on a memorial. They only remembered her voice, calm and steady, telling them to hold on, that help was coming, that any flag was welcome. That voice became the seed of a generational shift. A disproportionate number of those children entered careers in diplomacy, emergency services, and interspecies relations. 2 became ambassadors. One, a girl named Yara Chen, who had been 4 years old when the reactor failed, grew up to command the Terran SAR vessel Promise, the same ship that had once saved the life of Captain Drex of the Vrax. She would say, in her command interview, that she had no memory of the rescue itself, only of the sound of Reyes' voice. She never forgot the sound, but the deepest consequence of the cormorant was not the ceasefires or the memorials or the careers it launched. It was the quiet, structural transformation of galactic law. Before the cormorant, the open distress band was governed by a treaty that required only monitoring, not response. After the cormorant, that treaty became politically untenable. A coalition of civilian organizations, supported by veterans of the rescue from every empire, drafted the Reyes Protocol. The protocol mandated that any ship receiving a distress call on the open band must respond if it was within range, regardless of origin or affiliation. The penalty for non-response was not merely legal, it was social. A captain who ignored a call would face public censure, loss of command, and a permanent mark on their record. The protocol was ratified by 7 of the 9 empires within 4 years. The remaining 2, holdouts who cited sovereignty concerns, faced such intense domestic pressure that they adopted it informally anyway. The open band had been transformed from a void into an obligation, and that obligation was named after a woman who had never asked for any of it. Ensign Priya Varma, the sole survivor of the volunteer team that stayed behind, spent 11 months in a rehabilitation facility. Her radiation burns healed, but her spine did not. She would use a mobility frame for the rest of her life. When she was discharged, she was offered a ceremonial position and a pension. She refused both. Instead, she enrolled in a cross-species medical program on Jaith Prime, studying spinal regeneration techniques under Jaith physicians who had been inspired by the rescue to share their medical technology with other species for the first time. Within 6 years, Varma was leading a research team that developed an affordable spinal graft procedure, adapted from Jaith biology, that restored partial mobility to patients from dozens of species, including her own. She never spoke publicly about the cormorant, but in her office, she kept a single photograph, the crew manifest from the doomed freighter, with the names of the 13 fallen circled in red ink. She looked at it every morning before she began her work. The memorials on 9 worlds became sites of pilgrimage, not just for humans but for all species. Every year, on the day of open signal, delegations from each empire would travel to the memorials and recite the 11 words in their own languages. The Kesh version was carved in angular script, the Jaith in flowing bioluminescent glyphs, the Vrax in chiseled predator marks. A linguist from the Tenderi Concord published a study showing that the phrase, "any flag is welcome here," was now the most translated sentence in galactic history, surpassing even the basic greetings of the founding treaty languages. The phrase appeared on currency, on public buildings, on the hulls of rescue vessels. It was spoken at weddings and funerals. It became a shorthand for the idea that mercy was not weakness, that honor was not exclusive to one's own kind, and that the galaxy had, for one moment, chosen to be better than its history. The deeper twist, the one that took decades to fully surface, concerned the final transmission itself. The 11 words that Amelia Reyes typed while running to the launch bay had not been composed in that moment. Years later, a data archivist discovered that Reyes had written them years earlier, during her service in the SAR fleet. She had submitted them as a proposed motto for the Terran Rescue Service, a line that would appear on the side of every rescue vessel. The proposal had been rejected by her superiors, who considered it too informal, too sentimental. Reyes had accepted the rejection and moved on. She had never told anyone that, when she transmitted those words from the dying cormorant, she was quoting herself. a phrase she had believed in so deeply that she had tried to make it official policy, and when she could not, she had simply carried it with her, until the moment came when she needed it. And that moment made it the most famous sentence in the galaxy. The archivist who found the original proposal, a Jaith researcher named Uleth, published the discovery in a public archive. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. The Terran Sar fleet, which had rejected the phrase 40 years earlier, formally adopted it as its official motto within a week of the publication. The commander who had rejected it, long retired, issued a public apology, saying that he had been wrong and that the galaxy had been right. On the day of open signal, every human rescue vessel that was in port transmitted the 11 words on the open band simultaneously as a single voice. And for the first time, the phrase that had been a plea became a promise. What the cormorant left behind was not just a story, it was a framework. The galaxy had always known how to wage war. It had always known how to hold grudges, how to count casualties, how to justify violence across generations. What it had not known, what no one thought possible, was that a single act of unconditional sacrifice could become a gravity well, pulling everything around it into a new orbit. The Kesh-Jaith War ended not because either side won, but because the commanders on both sides could no longer look at each other without seeing the faces of the people they had saved together. The Vraxtenderi conflict stopped not because of a treaty, but because the soldiers refused to fire on people who had held their wounded. And the Feln Alliance and the Drith Compact, who had no direct involvement in the rescue, ended their war simply because they realized they were the only ones still fighting, and the shame of it had become unbearable. The question that historians still debate, late into the night in academies on 100 worlds, is this: was the cormorant a miracle or a mirror? Did it change the galaxy, or did it merely reveal what the galaxy had always been capable of, if only someone had the courage to ask? Captain Amelia Reyes never answered that question. She died before she could see the memorials, before she could know that her words ended wars, before she could meet the children she saved. But if you stand on any of the 9 worlds where her name is carved, if you read the 11 words in any of the 9 languages, you will notice something peculiar. The name at the bottom of every monument is not just a name, it is a question, and the galaxy, for all its history, is still answering it. Historians call the Cormorant incident a singularity, a moment when the accumulated weight of small, forgotten kindnesses suddenly crossed a threshold and rearranged the political gravity of an entire galaxy. But that word, singularity, misses something essential. A singularity is a point of no return, a collapse inward. What happened on March 17th was the opposite. It was an expansion outward. It was the moment the galaxy stopped collapsing into its own history of grudges and realized it could choose something else. Amelia Reyes was not a diplomat. She was not a philosopher. She was a captain who had spent her career pulling strangers out of dying ships because she believed that was simply what you did. She never wrote a manifesto. She never gave a speech. She typed 11 words into a console while running toward a jammed launch clamp, and those words became the most translated sentence in galactic history. The lesson of the Cormorant is not that one person can change the galaxy, though she did. The lesson is that the galaxy was already full of people waiting for a reason to be better. They just needed someone to give them one. The open distress band still exists. It is monitored now, not out of treaty obligation, but out of a cultural memory that refuses to fade. Every year, on the day of open signal, the descendants of the rescued children speak at memorial ceremonies. The daughter of the Vrax general who voted for permanent ceasefire now teaches galactic ethics at the University of Tenderi Prime. The son of David Okonkwo, the engineer who died beside Reyes, serves as ambassador to the Jaith Combine and keeps a framed copy of the manifest on his office wall. Priya Varma's spinal graft procedure has restored mobility to over 300,000 patients across 47 species. The threads of that single act of sacrifice are still weaving themselves into the fabric of everyday life, quietly, persistently, invisibly. And the question remains, was the cormorant a miracle or a mirror? Perhaps it was both. Perhaps every moment of decency is a mirror waiting for someone to look into it and recognize what they are capable of. Amelia Reyes held up that mirror. 9 empires looked into it, and what they saw was not a stranger. It was themselves as they had always hoped they could be. If this story moved you, consider what it would mean to be the person who answers the next call. Not in a galaxy far away, but right here, right now. Decency is not a resource that runs out. It is a frequency that only needs someone to transmit. Subscribe and hit the bell because we tell the stories that remind you what the signal sounds like. And if you ever find yourself in the dark with no help in sight, remember the 11 words. Any flag is welcome here. They might just save your life.